Yes, as we're starting to hear more about psychedelics in psychiatry, then memories are dimly starting to stir that we have been here before, that psychedelics and psychiatry have a shared history. And this is tend to be conceived, I've heard over the last few years, people talking about the sort of first wave of psychedelic science. Here's how it's summed up in the huge best-selling book that's introduced psychedelics to the mainstream audience, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. He writes very, very well in this, I think, about this, what he calls the sort of first stage of psychedelic science. So this is how he periodizes it. He says, in the 1950s, psychedelics exploded upon the West with the discovery of LSD and its introduction into psychiatry. And this this period of research continued until the mid-1960s, when he says psychedelics were outlawed and forced underground. So I'm going to outline a rather different story, one in which the use of psychedelics in therapy started much, much earlier than the 1950s, and one in which it came to an end for a variety of sort of more complex reasons. It wasn't simply banned. So I'll start this survey over 100 years before the 1950s, in 1845, with Jacques-Joseph Moreau and his book in English, Hashish and Mental Illness. It might be objected that hashish, cannabis, is not a psychedelic. I think it is at the dose that Moreau took it. He took it in oral doses. Smoking cannabis in those days was not a thing. And in doses of about 3 or 4 grams. So, a very powerful dose, at which one becomes comatose, unable to move or speak, and immersed in kind of very intense mental ideation for hours on end. Moreau's idea of what was going on here was what would later become known as psychotomimetic theory. He believed that when you took hashish, you experienced a lot of the symptoms of mental illness, so delusions, distortions of time, idées fixes, he's itemized them all, but with one major difference, which was that there was a part of the mind that stayed completely rational, that recalled that he'd taken a drug and was able to converse. So he thought that hashish would be extremely useful for treating his patients, and he ran quite a lot of trials with patients, and what he found was an extremely confused and varied picture. On some of his patients, it seemed to have no effect at all. Others became very excited, often with fits of laughter that would go on for hours. Still others became very calm and very lucid, and they could talk about what was going on and had sort of developed insight into their condition. Others became very withdrawn. Either they were very tired or, just sort of poleaxed by the kind of intense experience, or they were confused. Still others became paranoid and hostile. So Moreau quickly realized that this was not going to work as a therapy. It was too intense and powerful and hard to control. But he nevertheless thought that hashish could be extremely useful to psychiatry. He just thought it wasn't the patients who should be taking it, it was the doctors. Because, as he said, we spend all our times trying to figure out what's going on in the minds of people in extraordinary mental states. It's very, very hard to figure it out. But here, with hashish, we can take a large dose of it, and we can journey into this world of extraordinary mental states. We can appreciate it and understand it for ourselves, and we can come back safely. So the first of what we would now regard as the major or classic psychedelics to be investigated by science was mescaline, initially in the form of the peyote cactus, its natural form. And this is the great American neurologist of his era, Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell took some peyote buttons in 1896 lay down in a darkened room and had hours of what he called brilliant visions. He wrote up a description of the effects, concentrating particularly on the visual phenomena. He compared them to other neurological phenomena, such as migraine auras. He thought that this was an extraordinary and valuable tool for investigating states of mind that were normally extremely hard to investigate. He decided, though, that it wasn't something that was going to work in therapy because it was just too much of an ordeal. It was too physically intense, too grueling. His neurasthenic patients, who he was putting through his rest cure, people with nervous weakness, wouldn't be able to stand it. But after Mitchell's report, mescaline was widely investigated by psychologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists, particularly after 1919, when it was synthesized for the first time in a laboratory in Vienna. And then in 1920, so exactly a century ago, Merck started supplying it as a research chemical. So all the way through the 1920s and 30s, there was widespread investigation of mescaline. It was given in some contexts to patients where it was found, as Moreau had found it, to be unreliable and difficult to manage, and it was also felt unethical to try, these powerful drugs on patients on whom it might have a negative effect. So a lot of the trials took place at places like Heidelberg Psychiatric Hospital, and they were on junior doctors and medical students, and the people who conducted these trials, Kurt Beringer, Wilhelm Meyer-Gross, found out, as Moreau had done, that you could inject people with mescaline. They could be immersed in florid hallucinations, and then while these were going on, they could also talk and explain exactly what they were seeing. So they generated hundreds and hundreds of pages of subjective reportage, and it was very hard to know what to do with this. The most productive intervention came from Heinrich Kluwer when he was working in Chicago in the late 1920s. He read all these hundreds of pages of reports. He took mescaline himself, and he noticed that beneath all these florid descriptions, there seemed to be certain geometrical patterns that recurred, which he called form constants. So the lattice, the tunnel, the spiral, the cobweb, and he hypothesized that this was telling us something about the way that the eye and the brain interacted, and that mescaline must disrupt this mechanism somehow, and these form constants must be a result of that. So after this, a lot of the research on mescaline went in this direction of cognitive psychology. Psychiatrists started giving it to artists and getting them to paint their hallucinations. Also gave it to thinkers and philosophers, so people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Walter Benjamin. So, long before the 1950s, psychedelics had been investigated and researched in all kinds of different ways, many of them sort of very, very interesting and imaginative. What happened in the 1950s was that psychiatry in general took a more biological turn. With the arrival of LSD, there were now two substances, LSD and mescaline, that were conceived as psychotomimetics. They were believed to produce model psychoses. And of course, with the arrival of chlorpromazine, by the mid-1950s, there was also now a substance that could switch off these psychoses. So they could be used experimentally, and they were used very widely in the search for a chemical cause of schizophrenia. This is Weyburn Psychiatric Hospital up in Saskatchewan, up in the prairie. And this is where Humphrey Osmond, the British psychiatrist, was working together with his Canadian colleague Abram Hoffer and developed a theory along these lines. Osmond, together with John Smithies, who he'd worked with in London, had noticed that the mescaline molecule seemed to be quite similar in structure to the adrenaline molecule. And their theory was that under certain conditions, maybe stress, maybe a hereditary disposition, the adrenal glands might produce a chemical that was a breakdown product of amphetamine that was rather like mescaline in its effects, as they called it, an endogenous schizotoxin, and this might be the chemical cause of schizophrenia. But while they were doing this, Osmond was also very interested in the mystical and spiritual effects of mescaline, and he attended a peyote ceremony with a Native American church in Saskatchewan, and he was amazed to discover there that they had been using peyote in the treatment of alcoholism very successfully for many decades. So it occurred to Osmond and Hoffer that it might be possible to use psychedelics, mescaline or LSD, in a clinical context for the same purpose. They ran into the same problem that everybody had run into before, that the effects of psychedelics are very unpredictable. So they started to develop a model which would later be known as set and setting. Psychedelics, unlike other psychopharmaceuticals, the effect is not really directly a property of the drug. It's much more determined by what they called set, which is the state of mind and the expectations of the subject, and setting, which is the environment, the context in which it happens. So by this time, by the late 1950s, Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical company who had developed and who supplied LSD, were quite unsure of how to recommend it as a medicine. They were unsure, for example, what dose it should be given in. So what they started doing at this point was just to give LSD out to psychiatrists all across America and Europe, free, on condition that they reported back and said how they were using it. So during this period, various different ideas emerged of how, more commonly LSD at this point, might be used in therapy. There was an idea which usually went under the name psycholytic, that if you gave relatively small doses to people, it would kind of lower their inhibitions, make them more suggestible, give them a bit more insight into their dreams or their memories or their complexes, that it would expedite talk therapy. There was another idea which was usually called psychedelic therapy, which was that you'd give usually a single and often a very large dose to a patient who would then have a very powerful, life-changing experience that you might be able to work with. So this was all going on through into the sort of early, mid-1960s when this research started to decline. For various reasons. The reason that's most often given is that by this time psychedelics had started to get a bit of a bad reputation. They were being used by the sort of psychedelic underground counterculture and starting to be perceived as problem drugs. And this was certainly part of it. It wasn't a climate that was helpful for therapy, but I think there were other reasons why psychedelic therapy started to decline at this point. There'd been a lot of experiments by this point. The US Army, for example, had given LSD to about 1,500 volunteer subjects by the mid-1960s, and they'd started to notice that there were a lot of negative effects associated with it in a minority of cases. They'd witnessed nervous breakdowns, long-term psychotic effects, and it was starting to look as if the volunteer subjects had a suicide rate that was 5 times higher than the control group. So just at the same time that psychoanalysts and psychiatrists were starting to develop therapeutic models for psychedelics, at the same time it was becoming obvious that these substances, were risky and they had potentially severe negative consequences. But this is, I think, what really made the difference. This was the amendments to the FDA regulations that were the Kefauver-Harris amendments of 1962. Here they are being signed into law by President Kennedy. These amendments were not targeted at psychedelics at all. They were a response to the thalidomide tragedy. But what they did was to establish that as well as proof of safety, proof of efficacy for drugs to be licensed had to be demonstrated in FDA-regulated trials, randomized controlled trials against placebo. And that human trials should be more strictly licensed. They should only be allowed when the proposed use was stated in advance, and adverse reactions had to be reported, and so on. So these had a very chilling effect on psychedelic research. Placebo trials had always been extremely difficult with psychedelics because they had such powerful psychoactive effects. There was really no doubt in the mind of either the subject or the researcher whether somebody had been given a psychedelic or a placebo. Under the new sort of FDA definitions, a quality drug was one in which, with reproducible effects, where a standard dose could be replicated and the same effects would be produced in sort of large numbers of patients. By this criteria, psychedelics were never going to be quality drugs. And all these ideas of set and setting that psychiatrists had started to develop, within the new sort of placebo-controlled trials, what to do with them. These were effectively extra pharmacological variables that had to be excluded. So after the 1962 amendments, it became harder to get permission to run trials with psychedelics. Nevertheless, they were not banned, they were not outlawed. They did continue at places like Spring Grove Hospital in Maryland. They continued through until the sort of mid-late 1970s. But if you look at the sort of picture of those trials in the last 10 years, you can see why they started to fade. It became very hard to draw a conclusion from them. There were various different trial designs. They were all attempting in different ways to comply with the new FDA amendments. And that meant kind of tilting the research towards the assumption that the beneficial therapeutic effects were produced directly by the drug action, which people had already established with psychedelics was not really the case. So in these sort of last trials, there were, for example, various dosage levels. Some tried LSD at low doses, some at high doses. Some of the low-dose trials were successful, and some of the others weren't. So there was no clear correlation between dose and effect that was possible to establish. Sometimes the drugs were administered with therapy and sometimes without. Sometimes they were administered in a community setting, sometimes in a hospital. It became very obvious that the attitudes and the expectations of researchers were producing different outcomes. I think that's happening again in psychedelic research today. And all these, were trials with small sample sizes and very little in the way of longitudinal follow-up. Often, as always with psychedelics, you'd get either very positive or very negative responses. When these were averaged out, you ended up with a misleading picture. So by the late 1970s, funding was starting to dry up. It was getting harder to get permission. It was harder to find people who were interested in researching psychedelics. The research had kind of lost its cutting edge by that point. So the history of psychedelics in psychiatry is long and complicated. What can we learn from it? Well, I think we can learn some facts about psychedelics that are, very, very well established. They were all pretty much obvious, I think, to Jacques-Joseph Moreau nearly 200 years ago, and there's certainly facts that would be obvious to most people with experience of psychedelics today. So one of these is that psychedelics can have powerful therapeutic benefits. This is not a mirage. This happens all the time. If you talk to people who've used psychedelics for a long time, most of them will either have witnessed or have personally experienced some powerful therapeutic effects, often, in contexts where, the intention was not therapeutic. So people will say, for example, I was very depressed, I was grieving deeply after a bereavement. After a while, my friends were all taking some psychedelics, so I thought I'd join them, and I really didn't think about my problems all night, but then in the morning when I woke up, suddenly it was as if a huge burden had been lifted. Or people say, for example, it was in the middle of the night and I was tripping and I'd lit up a cigarette and I just heard this really compelling voice saying, don't do that, you don't need tobacco, notice what it's doing to your lungs. And after that I threw it away and I never smoked again. So these kinds of things happen all the time, and I think what's important to recognize them is that these therapeutic benefits can be elucidated with or without clinical expertise. And as I said, even without therapeutic intention, they happen. They're as likely, I think, to happen, in a muddy field at a festival as they are in a sort of very well-designed clinic. There may indeed be reasons why they're more likely to happen in a muddy field at a festival. And from the very beginning, we've established that psychedelics don't behave like other psychopharmaceutical medicines. They are very variable in their effects. They're very unpredictable. People like Kurt Beringer and Maya Gross spent a lot of time in the 1920s trying to see if they could find any correlation between personality type and the sort of experience that people had. And they couldn't really. It's very, very hard to tell. But there are certain things that you can say. One is that psychedelics are, as Stanislav Grof once called them, non-specific amplifiers. So if people have a positive experience on psychedelics, it's likely to be an extremely positive experience. It might be an epiphany. It might be life-changing. Equally, if people have a negative response, that can be very, very distressing indeed, and it can have very long-term consequences. And the other thing that has been established, really from the very beginning, from Moreau de Tour onwards, is that these negative effects are much more likely in that minority of people who are mentally or psychologically fragile. That they're much more likely to suffer negative consequences. If you look at all the literature generated by psychedelic culture over the last 50 years, there's lots and lots of do's and don'ts and lists about psychedelics, and more often than not, number one will be, don't take psychedelics if you've got a history of mental illness or such a history in your family. So that's a particular weighting, that has been established again and again. So this all adds up, I think, to it's a picture that would immediately be recognized by people with experience of psychedelics, but it's a very odd clinical picture. How do we make sense of it? The concept that I've found quite useful is one that was offered slightly provocatively by Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico, who was actually the person who started this sort of revival of psychedelic research in the late 1990s. He was the first person to get do federally regulated trials on human subjects with psychedelics, with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a very powerful psychedelic. And Strassman's conclusion is that we could maybe think of these as super placebos. If a placebo is something that kind of changes our expectation of healing, psychedelics are really, really very good at this, and they can do this to an extraordinary degree. And I think you see this if you look at the way that they're used in indigenous traditional healing, say the Native American church peyote ceremony. What happens there is that, it's a very elaborate ritual that's filled with sort of metaphors and ideas of sort of, how it can be engaged with therapeutically. The peyote is given to everybody in the ceremony, not just to the patient. So everybody is in a very susceptible state. Everybody is sharing the experience. And then through the ceremony, through the ritual, a cultural script unfolds with a therapeutic pathway going forwards. And this is a context in which things that happen are very, very important and very sacred. So it's perfectly possible, for example, that the patient will have been in this context before in their own initiation ceremony, at the end of which somebody will have said to them, "You are now an adult." This is the kind of speech that, makes things true. So to be told in this context that the sickness has gone, you're going to get better. You don't need alcohol anymore. This is a very, very powerful context, and of course this is happening, communally with all the people who are going to be surrounding the patient and living the rest of their lives with them, and everyone will have experienced this together, and it will be constantly reinforced. So I think it's not hard to see how, in that kind of context, psychedelics can be extremely therapeutic. And if you look back at the history of psychedelics in therapy, I think this idea of a super placebo makes an enormous amount of sense of it. The question then, going forward into the future, is whether and how we can accommodate a super placebo in 21st century clinical medicine. Thank you.
You've just given the idea of group therapy a whole new meaning, really. Any questions at all? Just where the microphones are going around.
I'm Dr. Della Valle, consultant in general psychiatry. Has mescaline or any of those psychedelic drugs ever been used in the treatment of conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome?
In treatment of chronic fatigue syndrome?
Yes, or what people usually call fibromyalgia.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I mean, I would be really interested to learn the answer. I know people who have, I know it's been used informally. I know of people who have suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't think it's ever been officially clinically trialed. I think the same problem as the one that Weir Mitchell identified. You know, that this is, you know, a very physically demanding ordeal, you know, that goes on for very, you know, many hours with high blood pressure and so on. And I think it would be, it's in that sense, I think it would be quite hard to get permission to do it. But I would be very surprised if it hasn't been done informally.
Okay, in which case, Mike, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.